Some truths don't come crashing in. They enter quietly like a shadow beneath a courthouse door, like breath held too long. This isn't just a courtroom drama. It's a reckoning. A story of silence used as strategy of memory, carried like evidence of one woman who refused to flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She let their arrogance speak first, then she let the facts destroy them. They thought she was just another black woman sitting in the back, invisible, powerless, waiting. But she wasn't waiting for justice. She was justice. The man on trial mocked her, tried to humiliate her, then found out she was his boss. Now tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? The courthouse smelled like old paper and newly polished tile, the kind of sterile cleanliness that masked the tension soaking into every corner of the room. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, just loud enough to irritate but too soft to blame. Somewhere, a copy machine clunked into motion. On the other side of the chamber, murmurs floated through the wooden benches, spectators whispering, not because they were told to, but because the silence in the air asked them to. And seated quietly in the last row, back straight, hands folded over a small brown leather bag, was Jordan Miles, 32 years old, and exactly where she needed to be. She had walked in alone. No security escort, no briefcase. Just an understated blazer navy blue over an off-white blouse, and a look on her face that made people glance twice, not out of recognition, but because she didn't seem to belong, at least not in the way the others did. There was something too still about her, like a painting hung where a mirror should be. She had studied this courtroom for weeks, its routines, its rhythms, its reactions, and now she was here, not as a spectator, not exactly, but as a shadow, observing, measuring, waiting. The case being tried had nothing to do with her on the surface. A low-level assault charge, a cop accused of using unnecessary force during a routine stop. But Jordan knew better. Knew that nothing in this courthouse was ever routine, especially not when the name Officer Kyle Branson was printed on the docket in bold underlined text, just like the first time she'd seen it 16 years ago on the charge sheet that changed her father's life. She didn't come here for closure. She didn't believe in that word. She came for the moment when truth would have nowhere left to hide. It was during the witness recess, when the courtroom had settled into a slow, bored breath, that it happened. Officer Branson, seated at the defendant's table, turned. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was habit. But the moment his eyes landed on her, something in his posture changed. His lips curled not into a smile but into something thinner, tighter, a sneer meant to test the boundaries of what he could still get away with. "Well, damn," he said, just loud enough to carry. "What is this Bring Your Community Day? Didn't know we were letting the interns dress like that." A few chuckles flickered in the back row. Not loud, not proud. Just enough to stain the air. Jordan didn't blink, didn't frown. She tilted her head slightly, not in confusion but in the kind of calm that comes from knowing your opponent just showed his first crack. Branson leaned back in his chair, exaggerating the motion like a performer on a stage. "You lost, sweetheart. Civil courts down the hall. Here's where the real work happens." A bailiff shifted his weight near the judge's bench. No warning, no reprimand, just silence. The judge, an aging man with heavy lids and a reputation for maintaining order, flipped a page in his folder and pretended nothing was said. It wasn't just indifference, it was permission. Jordan exhaled once through her nose, quiet and deliberate. Her hands stayed still on her bag, but her eyes never left Branson's. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. That silence unsettled him. He stood up, smoothed his tie with the back of his hand, and stepped around the table. The sound of his boots against the linoleum echoed louder than they should have. Measured, threatening. "You deaf or just rude?" he asked, coming to a stop beside her row. "I asked you a question. You got a reason for being here, or are you just sightseeing?" She turned her face toward him, slow as dusk. "I think you've mistaken me for someone looking for your attention." Her voice was low-level, not a drop of aggression in it. But it landed in the room like the first crack of thunder before a storm. People looked up. Slowly, quietly. Not out of curiosity, but because they felt something shift, like watching a lit match fall into a dry field. Branson's jaw worked. He wasn't used to silence, and he sure as hell wasn't used to stillness. His usual targets either folded or flared. This one did neither. That made her dangerous. He glanced at the judge, who didn't look up, then back at Jordan. "Well, now you've got it," he said, voice tight. "My attention." He reached forward, a slow, calculated movement, and hooked his fingers under the strap of her bag like he was about to lift it, or maybe pull her up with it. Jordan didn't flinch. She didn't resist. But she let her right hand drift just slightly toward the side of her coat. "I wouldn't," she said so softly. It sounded like advice rather than a warning. His hand paused in midair, not because he was afraid, but because some ancient part of him, the part that survived this long by reading rooms before they turned, felt the shift. And for a second, just a second, he saw it. Saw that he wasn't in control. Not this time. Not here. Not with her. The judge cleared his throat, not to intervene, but to move the docket along. Branson stepped back like a man retreating from a cliff edge. He didn't realize he'd been walking until the wind shifted. Jordan adjusted her blazer not to smooth the wrinkle he'd made, but to remind herself that she was still grounded, still calm, still in control. In her mind, she recalled the first time she saw him 18 behind a police line, watching him shove her father into the back of a cruiser while smirking like he'd just solved a crossword. The way her father's eyes searched the crowd, not for help, but for someone to remember what really happened. Jordan never forgot, not the sound, not the feeling. Not the silence that followed when no one said a word. Now that silence belonged to someone else. She looked straight ahead, said nothing, and waited, because the moment was coming, the one she'd planned for, trained for, the one where truth wouldn't need to be shouted, only shown, and Officer Branson had just walked straight into it. For a moment, no one moved. The courtroom, usually a hum of shuffling papers and murmured side talk, held its breath without quite knowing why. Branson had returned to his seat, but his eyes kept drifting back toward the rear row, where Jordan sat motionless and unreadable. Her presence wasn't loud or obvious. She didn't wear a badge, didn't carry a case file, didn't stand out in any conventional way, but there was something in the stillness of her body, in the unshaken posture of her spine, that disrupted the air, more than a raised voice ever could. He adjusted his cuffs like a man brushing off doubt, but doubt clung heavier than dust in places like this. His fingers drummed lightly on the desk, not with rhythm or intent, but with the nervous energy of someone trying to remind themselves they were still in control. Yet no matter how many times he blinked or turned away, his peripheral vision kept catching her, a figure too quiet, too calm, and too present to ignore. Jordan didn't shift, didn't react, didn't even pretend to engage with what was unfolding at the front of the room. The witness had returned to the stand. The prosecutor was resuming her line of questioning. The defense attorney cleared his throat, leaned forward, and tapped a pen against the edge of his notebook. All the ordinary motions of a trial resumed like gears, slipping back into place. But none of it reached her. She was tuned to a different frequency now. One forged not in law school lectures, but in years of watching people like Branson work their damage behind the shield of procedure and protocol. Her breathing was slow, deliberate, each inhale calculated to ground her body while her mind watched from a higher place. This wasn't about anger. It never had been. Anger burns fast and draws attention too early. What she carried instead was something colder, more enduring: resolve, honed sharp from silence. From his seat, Branson spoke again, not to the court, but to no one in particular, his voice slightly raised just enough to reach where he wanted it to. "Funny thing about people who sit in the back like that," he muttered. "They always think no one sees them." No one laughed this time, not even the court officers. One of the younger attorneys turned his head slightly, like he'd heard something he wasn't sure he was supposed to. The judge, still scanning the paperwork before him, didn't lift his gaze. But everyone felt the shift, the crackling discomfort that comes when a power play misses its mark and leaves something raw and unresolved in its place. Jordan met Branson's stare briefly, just long enough to register that he was beginning to feel the weight of her silence. Then she looked away, not with dismissal, but with the kind of composure that makes a man question why he ever raised his voice in the first place. Inside, she felt the pressure building, not from him, but from the edges of the room, the invisible scrutiny of those who were beginning to wonder who she was, what she was doing there, and why the man on trial couldn't seem to stop reacting to her. That tension pressed in from all sides, subtle and tightening like water rising slowly in a locked room. But she didn't move. She didn't blink. Stillness was her shield now, and every second she held it, Branson unraveled just a little more. He stood again. This time not as casually. His shoulders were stiffer, his movements more deliberate but not quite stable. "I'm talking to you," he said louder now, eyes narrowing. "You here with the press, you got credentials." The prosecutor paused mid-sentence. The witness on the stand shifted uncomfortably. A few heads in the gallery turned, some in curiosity, others in growing unease. It was no longer a side comment. It was a confrontation. And yet Jordan didn't rise to meet it. She merely raised an eyebrow, tilted her head slightly, and said nothing. Branson stepped away from the desk, walking slowly, now crossing the space that separated him from the gallery, like a man unsure of his footing but unwilling to retreat. "This is a criminal court, lady," he said, "not a spectator sport. You don't belong here unless you've got a role." Jordan let the silence hold for a beat too long, just long enough to make everyone feel it. Then she spoke, her voice low, and even each word shaped with precision. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Branson stopped in his tracks. The judge looked up finally, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in objection but in concern. Something in the room shifted again like a breeze through a tightly sealed door. And somewhere in the back, someone, the bailiff maybe, or a clerk, exhaled louder than intended. That's when Jordan did something simple but devastating. She placed her hands on the bench in front of her and folded them again like someone settling into her seat for the long haul. She didn't rise. She didn't explain. But her posture said clearly, "I'm not going anywhere. And you don't get to decide that I should." Branson stood frozen, caught in a moment he didn't know how to end. His authority had always worked because people gave it shape by reacting, resisting, or retreating. Jordan had done none of those things, and in doing so, she made him look absurd. Made him question whether he was still the man in charge or just a man being watched. He turned away suddenly, muttering something under his breath, and walked back toward the defendant's table. The judge didn't admonish him, but he didn't look pleased either. The court resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. Every eye that had once been fixed on the trial now stole glances toward the back of the room, toward the woman who had said almost nothing but managed to shift the entire current of the day. Jordan kept her face neutral, her breath steady, her thoughts collected like stones at the bottom of a deep well. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to listen, to observe, to remember. And when the time came, she would speak. But not yet, because sometimes silence speaks louder than any outburst ever could. And right now, that silence belonged to her. Branson didn't sit long. He kept glancing over his shoulder like a man who'd left something unlocked and couldn't shake the feeling it was already gone. The courtroom had returned to its slow crawl of procedure. Testimony resumed, lawyers swapped glances over objections, and the judge began tapping his pen lightly against his case file. But no one was really listening the same way anymore. A subtle current had shifted beneath the surface, and though no one spoke it aloud, most of the room felt it. It wasn't just that Branson had barked at a woman sitting silently in the gallery. It was that she didn't blink when he did. Jordan sat exactly as she had before, her gaze. Steady posture, composed, breathing quiet but controlled. Stillness once again became her greatest power, but inside her chest a slow fire had begun to rise. She'd planned this moment for weeks, studied every motion, every rule, every face, but planning didn't prepare you for the feeling of being stared down like you didn't exist, like you had no weight. Her jaw was tight, not in anger but in restraint. There were lines she wouldn't cross. Not yet, not here. But there was one thing she had to do now. Not for drama, not for the room, but for herself. Without a word, she reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and pulled out her phone, an older model, dull black screen, scratched but carefully prepared. Her movements were slow, deliberate, designed not to startle, not to provoke, but to be seen. She held the device in both hands, thumb hovering over the side button, waiting for one beat longer than necessary. Then, with a soft tap, she activated the front-facing camera. The flash of white light spilled across her face like moonlight, breaking through cloud cover, sudden, quiet, unmistakable. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. Her reflection appeared on the screen, clear and calm, no filters, no mask, just a woman refusing to be made invisible. The moment caught Branson's eye from across the room. He stiffened slightly in his chair, watching her with a confusion that bordered on irritation. "What are you doing?" he snapped, voice cutting through the courtroom like an unexpected alarm. "You can't record in here! Turn that off!" Jordan didn't even raise her eyes to him. She wasn't recording, and he knew it. The red light wasn't blinking and no sound played. But the presence of that open camera, that cold piece of mirrored glass pointed back at the man who had just tried to reduce her to silence, did something to the air around them. It was no longer her who was exposed. It was him. "I said, turn that off," Branson growled, now rising halfway from his chair, a hand stretched out like he could reach across the space and undo whatever had just been set in motion. His fingers twitched as if itching to seize control again, but he didn't move further, not yet. Jordan finally looked at him. Slowly, steadily, and without the slightest change in expression, she raised her eyes and met his. The light from the screen lit one half of her face in a pale glow, leaving the other in soft shadow. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough to be almost gentle, but the words struck clean. "Funny how you never worry about cameras until they're facing you." The room went still again, quieter even than before. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for permission, that spreads like water, finding its way under every doorframe. The judge stopped tapping. The clerk's hand froze above the keys. Even the witness mid-sentence turned slightly to follow the current of attention. Branson didn't answer. He didn't know how to. And for the first time in what might have been his entire career, he looked not angry, not commanding, but uncertain. His mouth opened like he had something to say, but nothing came out. His hand, once so eager to grab, now hung at his side. Jordan lowered the phone slightly enough to show that she wasn't threatening, wasn't violating any rule, wasn't defying the court, just reflecting it. And in that reflection there stood a man not used to being looked at this way, not used to having his posture held under light that couldn't be redirected. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, not because of her, but because they realized what she'd just done. She hadn't embarrassed him. She hadn't insulted him. She had simply let him see himself, and worse, let everyone else see him too. Branson's knuckles turned white around the edge of the defense table. He looked at the judge, perhaps hoping for support, for a command, for some authoritative echo that would restore the power he just lost. But the judge, to his credit or cowardice, said nothing. Just sat still and let the moment pass like a wave rising over the sand. "You've got no right to be playing games in here," Branson muttered, quieter, now more to himself than anyone else. "None of this is supposed to be about you." And in her mind, Jordan nearly smiled, not because it was about her, but because he'd just admitted he didn't know who she was. She turned the screen off, tucked the phone back into her coat, and crossed her arms loosely, not to defend herself, but to let him see that she had nothing to fear. Not from his voice, not from his badge, and certainly not from his history. Because when a man like him finally realizes he's no longer invisible to the people watching him, he starts to falter. And when that moment comes, it's never loud. It's never dramatic. It just clicks like the shutter of a camera, catching something raw and true before anyone can stop it. She said nothing else. She didn't need to. The stillness returned, but this time it didn't belong to her. It belonged to him. Jordan had trained herself to breathe evenly in public spaces, especially in rooms thick with power and pretense. But as her phone disappeared into her coat pocket and the white glow faded from her skin, her pulse ticked slightly louder in her ears like the muted thump of distant thunder. From the outside, she was still a woman sitting quietly in a courtroom, not raising her voice, not moving with purpose. But inside, she had already begun sorting through memories, the way one sorts through broken glass, carefully, deliberately, and with the awareness that pain would come if she moved too fast. There were things about Branson he didn't remember, details he filed away under dismissed reports or sealed statements, moments he might have thought were buried for good beneath bureaucracy and time. But Jordan remembered everything, not in fragments, not in emotion-fueled snapshots, but in sharp clinical clarity that came from reading the same case file over and over until the ink felt burned into her retinas. She remembered her father's voice the morning he walked her to school for the last time. She remembered the scuff on his brown leather shoes, the ones he wore to parent-teacher meetings and school plays, and how the laces always stayed loose because he liked to slip them off quietly when he came home. It had been a spring morning, not warm, not cold, just enough breeze to rustle the flag outside the middle school. Her father had stepped in to break up a fight, a white student throwing punches at a younger black boy, and what should have been a quick intervention turned into something else entirely. When Officer Branson arrived 2 minutes later, he decided who the aggressor was before asking a single question. He charged toward the officer, the report said, displayed non-compliant behavior, caused a disturbance at a public institution. But there had been no charge, no shouting, no resisting. Just a man raising his voice to protect a child who couldn't protect himself. Jordan had seen it from across the street, backpack still slung over one shoulder, breath catching in her throat, as Branson's hand shoved her father's shoulder, twisted him around and cuffed him in front of a growing crowd of parents, teachers, and wide-eyed students. Her father didn't yell. He didn't struggle. He looked straight ahead like a man who knew what silence cost and hoped his daughter wouldn't carry it with her forever. At first they thought it was a misunderstanding, that surely someone would review the school's security footage, or interview the right witnesses, or notice how hastily the charges were filed. But the security camera at the gate had been non-operational that day. The one student who saw the full thing had signed a statement, likely coached, possibly pressured, that said Jordan's father was agitated and screaming incoherently. By the time he was arraigned, the public defender had already advised him to plead no contest. 6 months, no bail, no voice. Jordan never saw her father's name in the newspaper. Just a short police blotter note, local man detained following incident at public school. She remembered sitting in the back of the courtroom, much like she did today, too young to speak, too aware to look away. Her mother's hands trembled the whole time, holding her purse like it was the last steady thing in the room. No one defended him. No one asked why the report lacked timestamps, or why the camera logs went missing, or why Branson's paperwork was typed, printed, and signed within 30 minutes of the incident. She remembered visiting him once, only once, behind glass, a phone between them, his dress shirt still chalk-streaked from the classroom. His cheeks looked thinner, eyes sunken but kind. He didn't say anything about what had happened. Just asked, "Is your mother sleeping okay?" 19 days later, a letter came. Involved in a facility altercation condition, severe additional medical information unavailable. No photos, no body. Just a bag of personal effects, his cracked watch, a folded lesson plan, and a library copy of The Souls of Black Folk, its spine broken clean through the middle. Jordan had read the report at least 200 times since then. The original file had been sealed and later archived as non-reviewable, but through DOJ access protocols and persistence bordering on obsession, she'd located a mirrored digital copy stored on an outdated internal drive, buried deep in an inactive state repository. Someone had failed to delete it properly. That someone was the reason she still believed truth could survive in forgotten corners. She printed it once, not for legal purposes, but for herself. She ran her fingers down the margin, noting the misspelled witness names, the copy-pasted paragraphs, the identical phrasing used in 3 other unrelated cases Branson had filed. It wasn't just a bad report. It was a pattern. Branson didn't falsify details. He made the violence sound procedural, professional, and that Jordan understood was more dangerous than a lie. It was a system trained to disguise harm as order. Back in the courtroom, her eyes returned to him, not with rage, not with sorrow, but with the heavy clarity of someone who had stopped needing apologies. He still sat with his hands clenched into fists, unaware that the woman watching him now wasn't just another stranger he could push past with smirks and accusations. She was the living memory of the one man Branson thought the system had forgotten. And she carried that memory not as a wound, but as evidence. If she ever had a moment of doubt about what she was doing here, it had died the day she saw Branson's name resurface in a different state, attached to a similar case with the same strange phrases, the same missing footage, the same outcome. That was when she knew this wasn't about her father anymore. This was about all the people who didn't have daughters who became federal investigators. This was about the ones who disappeared without even a sealed file left behind. She shifted in her seat, not out of discomfort, but in tension. Her hand brushed the lining of her coat where, tucked into a stitched inner seam, a flash drive waited. It contained 10 files, not copies, originals. Every one of them tied to Branson. Everyone reviewed. Everyone verified. It wasn't time to use them yet. But the weight of them gave her spine its steadiness. And as the light outside the courtroom began to dim slightly, casting shadows across the tiled floor, Jordan leaned back, hands folded once again over her lap. She wasn't here for revenge, she was here for alignment. Because in a system that prefers to forget, someone has to remember, not with anger but with precision sharp enough to cut through silence. The air inside the courtroom had grown heavier, not because of any single word spoken, but because of everything that hadn't been. Silence doesn't just linger, it thickens, wraps itself around people's spines, crawls up their necks, and tightens the way light does when a storm is coming. Jordan could feel it not just in the way her own body remained perfectly still, but in how others were now trying not to look at her directly. They weren't sure who she was, but they knew she was no longer just a woman sitting in the back. And for someone like Branson, that unknown, the unspoken authority she carried in her stillness, was the most dangerous thing in the room. He had been tapping his fingers against the desk in short, uneven bursts, as if trying to play a rhythm no one else could hear. But as the moments stretched and the tension refused to break, the tapping stopped. He stood slowly at first, not with the swagger he usually carried, but with a stiffness that suggested calculation. His jaw twitched once as he exhaled through his nose, and without a word to anyone, he stepped away from the defense table and began walking deliberately directly toward the public benches. Jordan didn't move. Her hands remained gently clasped in her lap, her gaze locked forward with the same unreadable calm she'd held from the beginning. But her peripheral vision tracked everything: how Branson's steps echoed slightly louder than necessary, how the court clerk shifted uneasily in her chair, how one of the younger officers near the wall seemed to hesitate, uncertain if this was protocol or personal. "You think this is a game?" Branson's voice was low, but it carried. "You come in here with your phone and your attitude, and just sit there like you're untouchable." No one answered him. No one stopped him. Even the judge, who had spent most of the trial pretending not to notice anything beyond his paperwork, paused for half a second before lowering his eyes again like nothing unusual was happening. Jordan turned her head slowly, not to confront but to acknowledge. Her eyes met Branson's, not with defiance, but with that steady, chilling awareness that told him she wasn't afraid. Not of him, not of the badge, and not of the history between them. That kind of gaze doesn't shout. It exposes. Branson's nostrils flared. He took another step forward, then 2 more, closing the gap, until he stood just beyond the railing that separated court officials from the gallery. His hand hovered slightly at his side, not quite reaching, not quite retreating. "I asked you a question," he said louder now. "Who gave you clearance to sit in this courtroom?" Still, Jordan said nothing. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was control, the kind that strips bullies of their momentum by refusing to participate in the performance they're trying to provoke. Her fingers gently tightened around the strap of her bag, not in fear, but in grounding. She'd rehearsed this moment not in front of mirrors or cameras, but in quiet rooms where trauma and purpose met like old friends. She knew what would happen next. Branson's hand rose without warning. It wasn't a slap, wasn't a strike, but a crude, familiar act. His fingers reached down and gripped the collar of her blouse, twisting it with the kind of force that says, "You don't belong here, and I'll prove it." There was no noise, no yell, just the sudden tug of fabric and the sharp intake of breath from someone in the audience. A chair scraped behind her. Someone stood and then sat again just as quickly. Across the room, a junior attorney clenched his briefcase, tighter eyes darting toward the judge, then toward Jordan, but saying nothing. No one moved, and yet everything moved. Jordan didn't react, not in the way he expected. She didn't pull away. She didn't slap his hand. She didn't stand or raise her voice. She let him hold that twisted collar between his fingers and sat still, perfectly still, like her very presence was a mirror, and the longer he looked at her, the more of himself he was forced to see. Her eyes didn't flinch. They simply stayed fixed on him, cool and relentless like a camera, without a lens cap, quietly capturing every detail of his undoing. The moment stretched not in time, but in weight. 5 seconds. Maybe less. But to those watching it felt longer than any opening statement or cross-examination. Because in that instant, a man accused of assault had once again committed another one, this time under fluorescent lights in front of a seated judge, a full audience, and the illusion of justice hanging in the stale air. And no one said a word. Not the bailiff, not the judge, not even the witness who was now staring down at his own shoes. It wasn't just complicity, it was choreography, a routine too rehearsed to question. But even routines can crack. Jordan's voice, when it finally came, didn't rise above the hush. It didn't tremble or accuse. It landed quietly like a dropped stone in a still lake. "Are you sure you're handling the right person?" The words slipped through the room like smoke under a door, soft, slow, unmistakably dangerous. Branson blinked once, then again. His hand loosened, retreating like it had been burned, the fabric of her blouse releasing from his fingers as if letting go of evidence that had started to stain. He stepped back, suddenly aware of how many people were watching, and worse, how none of them were nodding. No one was laughing. No one was with him anymore. And Jordan, she sat exactly as before, composed, unwavering, untouched. But something in the room had shifted, not because she had fought back, but because she didn't need to. And in that stillness, she had drawn the first real line in the sand. The courtroom didn't return to normal after that. People pretended it did. They resumed scribbling in their notebooks, shifted papers, cleared throats, but the texture of the room had changed. It was as if someone had pulled back a curtain none of them wanted to admit was there, and now they were all trying to look past it without acknowledging what they saw. Branson had returned to his seat like a man walking backward into his own shadow, his shoulders, tight jaw, clenched hands pressed flat against the table as if grounding himself from the tremor he'd caused. But it wasn't the act that unsettled the room, it was the reaction he hadn't received. No reprimand, no warning. Not even a soft "that's enough" from the bench. Just silence, thick and guilty, the kind that wraps itself around your ribs when you realize you've been part of something and didn't stop it. Jordan remained seated perfectly, composed, her collar wrinkled but untouched, her eyes forward but unfocused. Inside, a storm was gathering, not of rage but of necessity, of knowing that the time for observation had passed and the moment for clarity had arrived. She had come into this courtroom planning to say nothing, to wait until the foundation cracked on its own. But now the weight of the room itself demanded more than silence. One breath, two. Then she stood, not abruptly, not with anger, but with the quiet resolve of someone who understood exactly what she was risking and why it no longer mattered. "I request permission to address the court," she said, her voice low but clear, shaped not to shock but to steady. For a second, no one moved. The clerk looked up, eyes wide, unsure whether to acknowledge her or pretend she hadn't spoken. The judge didn't immediately respond. He held still, as if uncertain whether this was a challenge or an anomaly he could ignore until it went away. Branson glanced over his shoulder, face pale now, his expression unreadable, caught between disbelief and the slow crawl of fear that comes when control begins to slip. Jordan didn't wait for approval. She took one step forward, then another, making her way down the aisle toward the front of the courtroom. Her footsteps weren't rushed, but they weren't hesitant either. They carried intention, measured and undeniable. At the podium reserved for presenting evidence, she stopped, reached into the inner lining of her coat, and removed a small worn phone. Nothing flashy, nothing high-tech, just reliable and shielded. She connected a cable from her device to the audio system built into the lectern, a port meant for exhibits, not personal recordings. And yet no one stopped her. No one dared. A soft beep sounded through the speakers. Then a voice, Branson's, lazy, dismissive, tinged with entitlement. "Want me to do it the same way as before?" Another voice followed, sharper, colder, unmistakably the judge's. "No, this time it has to be cleaner." And then Branson again, a quiet chuckle underneath his words. "Send the rejection notice to the court. I'll erase the name from the system." That was all. 3 lines. 10 seconds. But they fell into the room like a detonation. People froze mid-breath. Pens dropped. A journalist in the back stood without realizing it, his phone halfway raised before his hand caught up with what he was doing. Branson lurched from his seat. "That's fake," he barked. "She doctored that. It's not admissible." But the courtroom didn't look at him like they used to. There was no automatic support in their eyes, no deference in their posture. He had become what he never expected, a man everyone was watching because he was unraveling. Jordan didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her gaze was on the gallery, on the people who had spent the entire morning waiting for someone, anyone, to say what they were all afraid to say themselves. Then, quietly, she reached into her coat again and pulled out something even smaller than the phone, a dark blue badge with silver trim worn at the edges from use. "My name is Jordan Miles," she said, no louder than before. "I am a federal investigator with the Department of Justice Internal Affairs Division. I have been assigned to conduct a covert audit of this district's handling of civil rights complaints." The room dropped into a silence deeper than anything yet. Even Branson stopped moving. The judge leaned forward slightly, not in protest, but in something closer to dread. Jordan placed the badge beside the phone, her hand resting lightly on the podium, not clenched, not shaking, just still. "I wasn't here as a witness," she continued, her voice steady, unwavering. "I was here to measure how much this system trembles when it's finally asked to face the truth." No one interrupted. No one objected. No one moved. And in that moment, something shifted, not in policy, not in statute, but in posture. The weight of her presence had changed the shape of the courtroom. People weren't looking at her as a stranger anymore. They were looking at her like a compass, something that pointed toward a direction they'd forgotten existed. Because silence may preserve order, but truth spoken calmly, clearly, and without fear creates consequence. And now, it had begun. The moment the audio ended, the courtroom didn't erupt, it inhaled. One collective breath, sharp and cold like air, pulled in through clenched teeth. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows confusion or shock. It was the silence that settles when everyone in the room suddenly knows what they've been trying not to know. Jordan didn't move. She stood there at the podium, her hands resting lightly on either side, not gripping it like a shield, but simply anchoring herself to the ground beneath her. She could feel the attention now, not just from the gallery or the lawyers, but from the air itself. Every molecule had shifted. The fluorescent lights above flickered ever so slightly, casting a faint pulse across the polished floor, as if even the building recognized the weight of what had just been played. She didn't need to repeat it. 3 voices. 3 lines, and a 4th truth that none of them could look away from anymore. Branson stood frozen beside the defense table, no longer a man in control, but a figure trapped in a spotlight he hadn't expected to turn on. His fingers, once twitching with authority, were now stiff and restless, pressed against his thigh like he didn't trust them not to shake. He opened his mouth twice, lips moving without sound, as though his brain was still scrambling for a narrative that might explain away what they'd all just heard. But there was no spin that could hide the tone of that voice, his voice so casual, so practiced, so familiar with the mechanics of erasure. "She's lying," he muttered more to himself than to the room. "She cut it together. Anyone can fake a damn recording." No one responded. Not even the judge. Across the gallery, someone whispered, barely audible, "That's his voice." Jordan heard it, and she let it pass without acknowledgement. She wasn't here for murmurs or validation. She had learned long ago that truth didn't need applause, it only needed oxygen. She leaned forward slightly, just enough for her voice to carry with precision. "I didn't come here to shame you, Officer Branson," she said, eyes on him now, no tremble in her tone. "I came to document what you've already done to yourself." Branson's head turned toward the judge, a silent plea forming in his eyes, but the bench offered nothing. The man who had quietly allowed so much to pass through his courtroom now stared downward, not with conviction, but with calculation. He was measuring his next move, balancing risk and reputation, and for the first time in years, he didn't know which way the scales would tip. Jordan continued, calm but relentless. This recording wasn't pulled from a hacked system or anonymous drop. It was extracted from a secure DOJ database under federal warrant. Chain of custody intact. Full digital signature traceable. She reached into her coat pocket again and placed a sealed envelope on the presentation table, DOJ letterhead stamped across the top, its weight unmistakable to anyone in the legal world. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to make the truth concrete. And still Branson didn't speak. He was no longer battling her words. He was battling the room, battling the weight of eyes. He couldn't turn away from eyes that no longer gave him the benefit of doubt, simply because he wore a uniform and carried a gun. Then he snapped. "She's not even supposed to be here," he shouted suddenly, voice cracking just slightly at the edges. "She's not on record. There's no official assignment. She's bluffing." The judge finally looked up, but not at Branson. His gaze went to Jordan, and for the first time since the trial began, there was no mask behind it, just uncertainty and a flicker of something she hadn't seen in him before: caution. "Miss Miles," he said, clearing his throat, "I'll need you to confirm your credentials for the court." Jordan didn't blink. She reached slowly into her blazer, pulled out a second folder, and handed it to the clerk. Inside, her official appointment signed by the Department of Justice Authorization Code 2179K, filed under the Office of Internal Affairs. Everything dated, verified, and logged. No aliases, no errors. Just the truth wrapped in government ink. The clerk handed it to the judge, whose lips tightened as he scanned the first page. He said nothing. He didn't object. But the shift in his posture, a slight drop in his shoulders, the way he folded the paper too carefully, spoke volumes. Jordan let the moment breathe. She looked at the room now, not with authority but with intention. "This investigation has been active for 7 months. During that time, I've monitored case dismissals, procedural deviations, and internal communication across multiple offices tied to this courtroom." She paused. "You've all seen it. You've all felt it. A system that runs too smoothly when it shouldn't. Case after case swept under technicalities. Complaints that vanish. Evidence that's never reviewed. This recording is not an anomaly. It's a doorway." Branson tried to interrupt his mouth, moved fast words, tumbling too quickly to sound coherent, but no one listened anymore. The court reporter had stopped typing. The prosecutor stood still, arms crossed tightly across her chest, while the gallery remained frozen in a quiet that felt more like judgment than curiosity. Jordan placed her hands behind her back now, shoulders square, chin steady. "You don't have to believe me," she said softly, "but you can no longer pretend this isn't happening." And with that, she stepped away from the podium. She didn't retreat to her seat. She remained standing near the center of the room, not in defiance but in witness. Not to declare victory, but to hold the line. Because the truth once spoken out loud never retreats, and silence once broken never sounds the same again. The sound that followed wasn't loud. It was barely more than the gentle hum of air conditioning pushing through vents, but it carried with it the density of something permanent. It was the kind of silence that settled after a truth had been exposed so clearly, so cleanly, that no one dared to pretend it hadn't landed. Jordan stood there, not behind the safety of her bench, or beside any official, but alone, at the center of the courtroom where no one else had dared to plant their feet that day. She didn't fill the space with movement or explanation. She simply existed there, solid and unshaken, while the weight of her words continued to ripple outward in every direction. Across the room, Branson hadn't moved. His hand still hovered near the edge of the defense table, like he couldn't decide whether to grip it or knock it over. His jaw clenched and unclenched in slow, uneven beats, each twitch betraying a mind running faster than his body could respond. The color had drained from his face, not all at once, but gradually, like a man who just realized the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he'd believed. He took one breath, then another. Then he snapped. "You're not even supposed to be here," he said, voice trembling in ways it never had before, not with rage but with the rawness of a man who had always been in control and was now discovering what it meant to lose it. "You're lying. You planted that recording." His words didn't land the way he thought they would. No one jumped to his defense. No one nodded in agreement. In fact, no one spoke at all. The courtroom had become a witness not just to the truth but to a collapse. Jordan didn't flinch. She knew this moment would come, knew that men like Branson, who had built their power on volume and proximity, would always try to reclaim it through one last burst of intimidation. But the problem with fear is that it only works when you haven't already faced the worst version of it. She reached slowly into her inner coat pocket, not rushed, not dramatic, and pulled out a small item wrapped in black cloth. Unfolding it calmly, she revealed a rectangular badge, dark blue with a silver seal embossed at the center, glinting softly under the courtroom lights. She raised it high enough for everyone to see, no theatrics, just clarity. "My name is Jordan Miles," she said, her voice steady, not cold, not loud, but deliberate. "I am a federal investigator with the Office of Internal Affairs Department of Justice. Authorization code 2179K. The sound of that number echoed in the stillness, not because it was loud, but because it was real. And real, when it walks into a space long guarded by illusion, has a way of flattening everything around it. Branson's mouth opened, then shut. His gaze darted to the judge, to the gallery, to the camera at the back wall he had been ignoring until now. But the eyes that met his no longer belonged to allies. They belonged to people who had just been shown in full daylight that the man they once deferred to was no longer the one holding the highest truth in the room. "No," he mumbled almost to himself, now backing up one step like a man who'd forgotten how big the room really was. "No, this is a setup. This is political." Jordan didn't respond. She lowered her badge, placed it gently on the table beside the audio device, and folded her hands. Her body remained perfectly still, but her presence expanded, not with force, but with inevitability. Behind her, a few people began pulling out their phones, not loudly, not urgently, just in that quiet way people do when they understand history is unfolding in front of them, and no one's sure how long the window will stay open. Screens lit up, camera shutters clicked gently, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, every device in the room wasn't pointed at the judge or the attorneys, or even the defendant, but at the woman who had just declared herself the system's reckoning. The judge cleared his throat, not in objection, but because the weight in his chest had finally reached his voice. "Miss Miles, the court acknowledges your authority and presence." He said the words slightly slower than usual, like he was still processing what they meant. "Please proceed however you see fit." Jordan nodded once, and that single movement carried more gravity than any ruling he had given all morning. She didn't smile. She didn't soften. Because this wasn't the moment for relief or validation. It was the moment for consequence. She turned not to Branson, but to the gallery, to the people seated in rows, who had come expecting a trial, but now found themselves part of a revelation. Her eyes moved slowly across their faces, not judging, not pleading, just searching for someone, anyone who might carry this story forward with the care it deserved. She saw fear. She saw awe. She saw recognition. And in that recognition, she saw purpose. "I'm not here to tear this place down," she said softly. "But I am here to make sure we stop pretending it stands tall." No one clapped. No one needed to. Because when truth speaks plainly and without apology, even silence feels like thunder. Branson sat down finally, but not by choice. His knees gave slightly and his hands gripped the edge of the table like he was bracing for an impact that had already arrived. The judge looked down at his notes, not because they mattered, but because his eyes could no longer hold the weight of hers. Jordan stepped back from the podium, folded the cloth over her badge again, and placed it neatly in her pocket. She had said what needed to be said. Now it was their turn to listen. The moment Jordan stepped away from the podium, the weight in the room didn't lift. It deepened, settling like dust on courtroom furniture left untouched for too long. People didn't speak, didn't shift, didn't breathe too loudly, as if afraid any sound might break the fragile, suspended truth hovering between them. In that stillness, something essential had been exposed, and now everyone could feel it not just in their chests, but in their conscience. Branson sat slumped in his chair, his face frozen in the expression of someone who had finally seen his own reflection without a filter and didn't like what stared back. The badge, the recording, the quiet authority in Jordan's voice, they hadn't just pierced the narrative, they'd cracked the foundation. And though no one had yet used the words cover-up or collusion, the courtroom had been seasoned enough to know when a storm was forming outside the bounds of protocol. It wasn't loud yet, but it was coming. The judge fidgeted with the corner of his folder, a small tick betrayed by the sharp fold he created over and over again with the edge of his finger. His eyes had stopped returning to Branson, and now avoided Jordan altogether, landing instead on the space between papers like he could escape into white margins. Jordan didn't move far from the front. She remained close, calm, unmoved by the gravity she had just shifted, as if letting it settle into its natural orbit. She understood what would follow: scrutiny, retaliation, attempts to minimize or discredit, but she also knew that once light touched a room, it could never be as dark again. This wasn't her first investigation. It was only the first one where she decided to show her face. And that choice, calculated and costly, had transformed the courtroom from a site of judgment to a stage for truth. Behind her, the gallery wasn't just watching, they were recalibrating. People who had arrived, assuming this was another slow day in court, were now clinging to the realization that they'd witnessed something they might one day have to answer for. A young woman near the back clutched her notepad against her chest instead of writing. A man in a gray jacket reached for his phone, then hesitated, lowering it slowly like the moment deserved to remain unfiltered by social media. The air was no longer passive, it was expectant. Then came the first ripple. One of the junior attorneys at the prosecution table leaned over to whisper something to his colleague, his lips tight, his brow deeply furrowed. She nodded once, then began pulling up a document on her tablet, her fingers moving more quickly now, with the urgency of someone who had just realized they were part of something far bigger than the charge on paper. The court clerk, who had barely blinked during Branson's earlier outburst, now stared openly at Jordan as if seeing her for the first time, not as a disruption, but as a compass pointing to something she hadn't dared to name. Branson broke the silence next, though not in strength but in desperation. "You don't know what you've done," he muttered, voice low and hoarse, cracking beneath the strain of his unraveling pride. "You think you've won something here?" Jordan turned her head toward him slowly, her gaze steady, not smug, not angry, just real. She said nothing, because what he called winning she understood as witnessing, and he was right about one thing. She did know exactly what she'd done. The judge cleared his throat again, but this time it wasn't to assert authority, it was to fill a silence he no longer controlled. He leaned forward, adjusted his glasses, and addressed the room without lifting his eyes from the table. "We will take a short recess," he said, his voice thinner than it had been earlier that day. "Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. But even as the gavel tapped once, no one stood. There was an unspoken reluctance to move, as if everyone knew that standing now would mark the moment as real, official, irreversible. Eventually, bodies began shifting one by one with the quiet tension of people exiting a place they were afraid to be seen in. Branson didn't rise. He just sat, his face drained, his authority collapsing, not through argument but under the weight of exposure. Jordan stayed in place a few seconds longer, then collected the folder and her badge, with a kind of reverence, like she wasn't just holding evidence, but something sacred, proof that silence could be broken without shouting. She stepped away from the podium and walked to the far side of the courtroom, where she paused beside a tall, narrow window streaked with afternoon light. The glass was old, slightly warped, but it still reflected her shape faintly, like a memory slowly returning to form. She looked out, not because she needed a break, but because she needed the reminder that outside this room, the world hadn't yet heard what had just begun inside it. As people filtered out, a young woman brushed past her and whispered, "Thank you." It was so soft, Jordan almost thought she imagined it. She turned, but the girl was already gone, swallowed into the slow tide of bodies making their way down the corridor. Still, that voice lingered, not because it was grateful, but because it was awake. She turned back toward the window, her hand resting lightly against the frame, and for the first time that day she let her shoulders fall just slightly, not in defeat but in acknowledgement of the risk, of the weight, of the cost. She had stepped into a courtroom built on practiced forgetting and reminded everyone inside that truth doesn't wait for permission. And outside, the sky had shifted too. The sun had moved lower, casting long shadows across the courthouse step. A breeze stirred leaves along the sidewalk in slow spirals, like a signal that something had changed, even if the world didn't know it yet. But it would. And when it did, Jordan would still be standing. Not because she had to, but because she had chosen to. From the window in the quiet hallway outside the courtroom, Jordan could see the courthouse plaza slowly fill with late afternoon light, its gray stone tiles glowing with the kind of soft warmth that always arrived just before dusk. She stood still, one hand resting against the glass, her other holding the folder she had just carried through, what had moments earlier become the turning point of a much larger truth. She could hear faint voices behind the door, muffled, scattered, uncertain. But out here, everything was still like the outside world, hadn't yet caught up with what had just happened inside. It was always this way after the reveal she'd learned. That moment when evidence moved from file to fact, when silence was no longer enough to shield the powerful, and everyone had to sit inside the discomfort of what had been allowed for too long. But this case wasn't like the others. She had worked dozens of covert investigations, unspooled threads of corruption buried under years of procedure and polite deception, but never had she walked in with this much personal skin under the armor. Never had her own bloodline marked the point of origin for an entire system's unraveling. Her father's face returned to her not in pieces but whole clear as the morning he was arrested. He had been wearing that blue striped tie, the one she gave him for his birthday when she was 11, the knot crooked in a way he always claimed gave him character. He had stood outside that school fence with chalk on his sleeves and authority in his posture, not as a threat, but as a protector. And within minutes, it had all been rewritten by a man like Branson, quick with a pen, quicker with assumption, backed by a system that gave him the benefit of the doubt, and her father a case number he would never outlive. Back then, she didn't understand how fast truth could be distorted, how a calm voice could be reframed as aggression, or how paperwork once stamped became more real than memory. She just knew her father had tried to do the right thing, and it had cost him everything. She had never spoken publicly about it, not through law school, not through training, not even within the circles of oversight where colleagues traded war stories over late-night coffee. Her past remained sealed, not out of shame but as strategy. She couldn't afford to be the woman seeking vengeance. She had to be the one who walked in with precision, who investigated with such relentless clarity that no one could accuse her of bias, but that clarity came at a price. She had grown used to long silences, to holding back when others raised their voices, to sitting in rooms where men like Branson laughed too loud, and women like her were treated like shadows, present useful but not remembered. Sometimes her mother would call and ask, "Are you eating enough? Sleeping at all?" And Jordan would answer with a soft, "I'm okay, Mama," even when she wasn't. Even when the nights were thick with unprocessed case files and blurry photos of people who looked too much like the man she lost. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass, now letting her eyes close for a moment, not in exhaustion but in anchoring. She wasn't just building a case anymore. She was holding the weight of a memory that had been dismissed as a disturbance in a schoolyard, classified as non-compliant behavior, and left to rot in a sealed archive until she found it again. The charges had never been overturned. No apology had ever been issued. And yet here she was, standing in a place that once buried his name beneath bureaucracy, now lifting it into light through the very laws that tried to erase him. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was the court clerk, a young woman with tired eyes and a look that blended professionalism with quiet fear. She held out a slip of paper, an official request to reconvene signed by the judge, stamped in red like everything in the system had to be, for people to believe it mattered. "They're ready when you are the clerk," said her voice gentle. Jordan nodded, but before turning away, she asked, "Do you believe what you heard in there?" The clerk hesitated, eyes flicking toward the door. Then she whispered, "Yes, ma'am, I believed every word." Jordan offered a soft smile, not triumphant, just human, and said, "That's enough for today." She walked back toward the courtroom, her shoes tapping softly against the polished floor, each step measured not by pace but by purpose. Inside, the lights had been slightly dimmed, and the people seated now did so with backs straighter, eyes sharper, like they understood they were part of something no verdict could fully contain. She returned to her seat, but the room no longer viewed her as a spectator. She had become a center of gravity, and everyone else was adjusting their orbit accordingly. No longer was she the woman in the orange blouse who quietly took notes in the back row. She was the voice that had pulled back the curtain and dared them to keep looking. And as she settled in, fingers resting once again on the folder that had started it all, she let herself feel the full weight of what came next. Not just more questions, but the moment when the system would be forced to answer back. Because this time she wouldn't be the only one telling the story. The courtroom felt different when Jordan returned, like something sacred had been disturbed, and everyone was now trying to figure out how to sit inside that discomfort without shifting too much in their chairs. The overhead lights hummed faintly, but they no longer masked the nervous energy moving between bodies. Eyes didn't just glance, they lingered, uncertain whether they should look down out of habit or keep watching the woman who had quietly realigned the ground beneath their feet. Jordan sat with her back straight, hands resting calmly over the closed folder in front of her, her breathing steady despite the tension floating around her like static. She had learned long ago that power doesn't always reveal itself in noise. Sometimes it lives in the silence that follows truth when the lies have been peeled back and no one quite knows what comes next. She could feel it now, that invisible shift, like the first moment a ceiling begins to crack, not loud, not violent, just undeniable. And in that moment, Jordan didn't feel victorious. She felt responsible. She'd carried this case longer than most knew. Watched the pieces fall into place with the patience of someone who didn't need revenge, just confirmation. But now that it was all out in the open, she could sense something heavier creeping in from the edges, the understanding that exposing the truth was only the beginning. What came next wasn't in her hands alone. It belonged to everyone who had stayed silent until now. The judge, the court staff, the officers lining the back wall, even the spectators. They'd all seen something they couldn't unsee, and that meant they had to decide what kind of people they were willing to be from this point forward. Branson hadn't spoken since recess. His body language had changed, less confrontational, more withdrawn, his elbows tucked closer to his sides, his chin angled slightly downward, like a man who was still searching for the version of himself that used to command the room with a glance. But there was no command left. Just the shrinking presence of someone who had finally been told in the clearest terms possible, "We see you now." Jordan glanced at him briefly, not to provoke, not to gloat, but to witness. He didn't meet her eyes. Maybe he couldn't. The judge finally cleared his throat, leaned into the microphone with a voice noticeably quieter than before, and said, "Given the information presented and the verification of federal jurisdiction, this court will enter administrative review procedures immediately." There was no banging gavel, no dramatic final statement. Just those words, administrative review, soft and clean and devastating in their own way. Because that phrase meant that what had once been protected behind procedure was now open for scrutiny, and once that door was opened, it didn't close easily. Jordan kept her posture composed, but inside, a current of thought ran deep and fast. She had expected resistance, pushback, maybe even sabotage. What she hadn't expected was how quickly the courtroom would begin to shift itself once someone cracked the first layer. It was like people had been waiting for permission to admit what they already knew but had never said out loud. The man beside her whispered, "It's about time," under his breath, not for her to hear, but she did anyway. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see his face. He was older, in his 60s, maybe worn hands, and a file clutched against his chest like a shield. He didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the bench, like speaking those 4 words had been all he could manage after watching injustice win too many times. Her voice was quiet when she replied, "Truth takes time, but time doesn't wait forever." He nodded once, eyes moist but steady. Across the room, a woman in a green sweater finally raised her hand, not out of decorum but urgency. "I have a question," she said, her voice small but unwavering. "What happens now to him? To all the cases he touched?" The judge didn't answer immediately, and Jordan knew why. Because even the people in charge didn't always have the language to respond when accountability showed up uninvited. After a long pause, the judge leaned forward again. "Every case linked to Officer Branson's record will undergo review under the Department of Justice. A task force will be assigned, independent, transparent, and thorough." The woman sat back and the room exhaled, some with relief, others with uncertainty. Jordan felt the tremor in the air, the kind that follows the first true consequence in a space not used to delivering them. She stood not because she had something left to say, but because she needed them to see her once more. Not the badge, not the authority, but the person. The daughter who carried a father's silence into a courtroom and gave it back a voice. As she walked down the center aisle, her heels soft against the linoleum, people moved slightly to let her pass, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Not out of deference, out of respect. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up the late light, stretching long shadows across the plaza. She paused at the steps, closed her eyes, and let the moment wash over her, not as a conclusion but a beginning. Because justice doesn't always roar in with fire and fury. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits down without a nameplate, and says, "I've been listening all along." And this time it had. When Jordan stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the wind was softer than it had been earlier, brushing against her cheek like a quiet gesture of approval from something older than justice itself. The courthouse doors closed behind her with a muted thud, not dramatic or final, but certain like a punctuation mark placed at the end of a sentence that had taken years too long to finish. She stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, her hands resting at her sides, the folder still tucked under one arm, now lighter, not because the contents had changed, but because their meaning had finally been heard. The plaza ahead of her had begun to clear the crowd, thinning into quiet pairs and solitary walkers, each carrying their own private reflections on what they had just witnessed. Some glanced her way, others offered small nods, and a few turned quickly, as if overwhelmed by the thought of what came next. Jordan didn't need their recognition. She wasn't here for applause. She was here because a truth that had been silenced for too long had finally been spoken into a space that could no longer ignore it. She took the steps slowly, not from fatigue, but from the simple need to feel the ground again, firm, real weighting. Each footfall echoed just slightly against the stone, a soft rhythm that reminded her of the walks she used to take with her father on quiet Sunday mornings back before she understood how fragile safety really was. He used to hum under his breath, low and tuneless, and she never asked what the song was because it felt like something sacred, a language only he understood. She reached the base of the stairs and turned just for a second to look back at the building behind her. The tall columns, the glass doors, the seal etched into the stone above the entrance. It all looked the same, but something inside it had shifted. Maybe not in structure, not yet, but in spirit. Because now that building contained the memory of someone standing up when no one asked her to, and the ripple that courage left behind could not be unseen. Her phone buzzed softly in her coat pocket. She let it go unanswered. The wind picked up again, tugging at the edges of her coat, carrying with it the scent of spring-wet concrete, blooming grass, the faint trace of jasmine from a nearby tree. She closed her eyes, breathed in slowly, and let herself hold the moment not as victory, but as validation. "Hey," a voice called gently from her left. She turned to see a man walking up from the side path, his pace, careful hands tucked into the pockets of a well-worn denim jacket. He looked to be in his early 60s, salt at his temples, eyes lined not by age alone but by experience. "I saw you in there," he said, voice steady but soft. "Didn't say anything earlier. Just wanted to thank you." Jordan nodded, once her gaze meeting his with a calm that said, "You're welcome," without needing to speak. He hesitated before adding, "My brother." He had a run-in with that officer years ago. Never made it past booking. Thought nobody'd ever say his name again. "What was his name?" she asked gently. "Marcus. Marcus Bell." Jordan repeated it in her mind, letting it settle there beside her father's name, not as a file or a case, but as a person whose memory deserved presence. "I'm sorry," she said simply. He nodded, swallowed hard, and looked toward the courthouse. "Not anymore." They stood in silence for a few more seconds, just breathing, letting the wind carry the unspoken weight between them. Then he gave a small wave and walked away, shoulders a little straighter than before. Jordan turned back to the street and started walking the rhythm of her steps, slower now, not from exhaustion, but from intention. Every block she passed held echoes of people like Marcus, like her father, like the others, whose names had been left off, reports whose voices had been deemed too angry, too emotional, too complicated to trust. But now the silence they'd been buried under had a crack in it, and light, once it finds a way through, doesn't retreat. She reached the corner and waited for the light to change. A group of teenagers crossed the street beside her, laughing too loudly, full of life and noise, unaware of what had just shifted a few hundred feet behind them. And that somehow brought her more peace than anything else could. Because the world didn't stop for justice. It moved on. But now it would do so with one more piece of truth sewn back into the fabric of its memory. And Jordan. She would carry their names forward, not out of duty, but out of love. The light turned green. She crossed the street and didn't look back. In a world where silence often protects the powerful, this story reminds us that truth spoken calmly, bravely, and without apology has the power to shift everything. It teaches us that justice doesn't always arrive with sirens or grand speeches. Sometimes it walks quietly into a courtroom, stands alone in the face of abuse, and simply refuses to back down. Jordan's journey shows us that standing up for what's right may not always be easy, but it is always necessary. She carried her father's memory, and with it the memory of so many others whose stories were buried beneath red tape and indifference. And through her strength, she gave those stories a voice that could not be denied. For those of us watching, especially those of us who've seen decades pass, who've witnessed injustice repeated and too often excused, this story is a reminder that it's never too late to speak up, to act, to demand better. Our wisdom, our memory, and our courage matter. They are needed now more than ever. So, if this story moved you, if it reminded you of the quiet strength we all carry inside, please consider liking this video to help others find it, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing to our channel for more stories that speak truth to power. Your voice, your presence, and your support help bring these stories into the light where they belong. Because in the end, justice isn't just a verdict, it's a choice. And together we can choose to remember to speak and to never look away again.